In this video, I want to talk about how yoga can affect trauma and how you can practice trauma-informed yoga. First, I think we should start by defining what trauma actually is, because I think a lot of times people think of trauma as a bad thing that happened in your past that you now need to get rid of. And I don't necessarily think that that's entirely true. Because trauma is any event that overwhelms your nervous system and leaves you different as you move forward in life. It changes how your brain functions, and that change in brain function affects how you respond to life around you. And if the way that you're responding to life changes, that might seem bad because you're used to your normal way of life, but it's not necessarily always bad. It's also important to note that trauma exists on a spectrum like everything else in life. So it's not just black and white, I have trauma, I don't have trauma. There are lesser traumas and more intense traumas. Now, if you want to dive deeper into what trauma actually is and how it's affecting us, I highly recommend checking out the book The Invisible Epidemic by Paul Conti. In this book, he talks about how trauma works and also how we can begin to heal from it. And if you don't have time to read the full book, I highly recommend checking out the podcast episode on the Huberman Lab podcast, where Dr. Huberman interviewed Paul Conti. And in this podcast episode, Paul Conti said, "We so often try to change the traumas of the past in order to control the future. But what really happens is the past traumas control the present. And it doesn't have to be that way." And I think that's a good segue into how does yoga actually benefit trauma? Yoga is one of the things that Paul Conti talks about in his book and the podcast episode, but I want to look at it specifically. So I think the number one benefit of practicing yoga is it brings you into that present moment, whether it's on your yoga mat in a yoga class or in your meditation or whatever. Yoga is about recentering and grounding into the present moment, into the breath. And so becoming aware of the present moment through yoga allows you to be able to recognize, oh, hey, this trauma is affecting me. Because a lot of times we are so disconnected from the present moment and we're so in our minds in the past or in the future that we don't even recognize what traumas are affecting us and our present moment reactions to life. And so by using yoga as a time of observation to simply notice, oh, hey, that thing from the past is affecting me right now. Interesting. Another quote from Paul Conti in that podcast episode was, "When trauma is hidden inside, it is able to control us. When we bring the trauma to surface, then we can take its power away." So by sitting in meditation and recognizing, oh, this trauma is affecting me, and bringing it back up to the surface, you're then able to look at it and be like, hey, you don't have to control me right now. I recognize that you are affecting me, but you don't have to control me. And that can be such a powerful recognition in your yoga practice. Another thing that I think meditation especially is great for is helping you take that outer perspective from your thoughts instead of constantly identifying with your thoughts and saying, okay, there's this trauma on the surface. Where could that possibly be coming from? Like, what in the past may have caused this? And then instead of emotionally attaching to that cause or reliving that trauma, you just observe from an outer perspective. I know it sounds kind of weird, but if you practice meditation for a while, you begin to understand what I mean by observing from an outer perspective. And then once we're able to observe that root cause and not emotionally attach to it, we can begin to notice when that trauma resurfaces again. And then instead of repeating your emotional reaction to this trauma, you simply observe it from that outer perspective. Another thing that I think meditation is especially useful for is beginning to observe a repetition compulsion that usually comes with trauma. Now, another thing that meditation can be especially useful for is helping you take that outer perspective in life, not just in meditation, and observe when that trauma is being triggered or is resurfacing. And then instead of allowing yourself to relive that trauma, whether that's through reliving the emotions in your mind or recreating that traumatic scenario. So repetition compulsion is a common thing with trauma where the limbic system is trying to recreate the feeling because the limbic system doesn't really have a sense of time, or the limbic system is thinking, oh, if I get back to this state of feeling, then I can resolve it. But when we sit and think about it from an outside perspective, you can begin to understand the past and the root cause of these traumas. And in understanding it, we can begin to release the shame and the guilt that we may be holding on to around the trauma. And in letting go of the shame and guilt, we are truly able to grieve, process, and let go of the trauma. So it can no longer have control over the body and the mind. Now, another way that yoga is really effective in healing trauma is yoga helps you reconnect with your body. A lot of times when people experience trauma, in order to avoid feeling that you have to feel in order to let go of the traumatic event, they disassociate from their body because the body is where the feeling or the emotion is being stored. And so by using a practice like yoga to reconnect with the body and begin to feel into all of the areas and be like, whoa, that hip is really tight, or my shoulders are really tight, what's going on here? And begin to release the tension in the muscles, that can also begin to let you release the emotions from your mind. Because oftentimes this tension that we're holding in our body is the constant reminder of the trauma, like physically. But by releasing the tension, you are able to then release those thought patterns that have been associated with that tension and that trauma. Now, how can you practice a trauma-informed yoga? Well, first you become informed of the fact that sitting in meditation with your thoughts and feeling into your body will resurface some of that trauma, and being prepared for whatever may surface. I think the most important part of being trauma-informed, though, is understanding yourself enough to know what trauma you can handle alone and what trauma you might need to seek professional help with. Now, at first, this might be a little difficult for you to differentiate because bringing trauma to the surface is always uncomfortable, but I think a good way to think of it is if you can bring it to the surface and take that outer perspective without reliving the trauma and simply think about the root cause, understand it, and then let it go through meditation and journaling, that is a trauma that you can hopefully safely navigate through yoga. However, if a trauma resurfaces and instead of being able to take that outer perspective, you find your nervous system getting caught back in that limbic system loop of wanting to relive that trauma in order to resolve it, remind yourself that that's not how you resolve it. Simply close the trauma and seek help from a professional therapist, or maybe come back to it at a later date. And I think that's the most important takeaway of this video, is that in order to heal trauma, you cannot continue reliving the trauma, because then you're just stuck in that same cycle. You need to break the cycle by recognizing, oh, I'm being affected by trauma right now. And then instead of letting that emotional limbic system body take over, in order to heal, you need to recognize, oh, this is a traumatic pattern. And then sit with it, understand it, and let it go. Because it's in the letting go that you find healing.